This is another T-Rex talk about the big lessons from Ukraine. We already had an episode about the small lessons of Ukraine. I think it was a couple months ago. It was a few weeks into the war, and we were looking at just a lot of footage, handheld camera footage, live streaming footage directly from kind of the front lines of that invasion. And there were a lot of lessons that were visible, and a lot of it was really small individual level stuff, just kind of what the face of 21st century war looks like and fighting in built up areas and what sort of tools are useful, what sort of things are really good to have in that sort of situation. And a lot of it was pretty obvious stuff, short-range communications, drones, thermal, etc. It's not surprising, but it was really helpful to visually see some of this stuff and see how it actually played out. And sometimes there were even incidents where there were multiple camera angles, so you could really get a better sense of what was working and what was not working. And I bought a couple of different items based on some of these lessons, including concertina wire. Quick note, don't buy concertina wire from Amazon. You get stuff that is simultaneously too flimsy to be useful and too thick to be sharp. And there's no telling whether it comes clipped, which you definitely need clipped concertina wire. So I'm currently in the market for a new concertina wire guy. What about big lessons? I think there's some big lessons that at this point in the war are fairly obvious and people really need to learn from. And I'm not talking about the biggest lessons. I'm not talking about morality and just war theory. Those are very important, but David Botkin is a much better commentator on just warfare, has done a lot more research, has a lot bigger thoughts on it. So I'm mostly going to be focusing today on just kind of the nation level or sort of higher level lessons from watching this war. And it should be stated at this point that no winner is evident. Ukraine continues to win at the tactical level most of the time. Russia continues to win at the operational level most of the time, because that is where their focus is. And at the strategic level, things are still fairly unclear. But the stuff that is clear is really fascinating. Localized light infantry forces taking ground back from mechanized units, denying the enemy air superiority, sinking cruisers, stuff like that. By the way, the Moskva was the first cruiser to be sunk in 40 years, and it wasn't sunk in a naval battle, but apparently by 2 missiles fired by 1 truck. So this is the flagship of the Black Sea. It's a 10,000-ton cruiser carrying over 100 missiles. And it got into a fight with a 10-ton truck carrying 4 missiles and lost. So we are now watching that stereotypical fight between big modern country and small modern country that everyone says that global war on terror didn't give us. It's a fight that's been speculated about for decades, and it's not actually going the way that a bunch of people predicted. So on the one side, obviously, we have this massive national Russian force rolling out vast amounts of state-sponsored, state-developed, state-produced equipment. And they're going up against a small nation that has disorganized small units using limited gear, which they are augmenting with commercially off-the-shelf equipment. Now, they are getting new military gear from neighbors, but they're having to adapt to use the new gear. It's not custom-built stuff that they're building for their own doctrine and their own purposes. And they're also using non-military stuff to great effect. I think that's a big point here. And again, while no winner has emerged, it is obvious that the small, agile modern power using off-the-shelf stuff is doing really, really well. And the problem is that America's military policy has been much more Russian in style than Ukrainian in style for a very long time. It has become big, it has become slow, it has become stagnant, heavily politicized, and it has a lot of obsolete stuff. Now, obviously, there's a significant gun control argument here. The big government folks who claim that you need F-15s and nukes to resist a superpower are the same people who lost Afghanistan to dudes with small arms and are currently watching Ukrainian foot soldiers with DJI drones thrashing big state military units. Not to mention the people who this week are saying that no civilian needs to own an AR-15 still have Ukrainian flags in their profile pictures. But never mind, I want to make a bigger national defense point here. And I want to recommend to you a podcast, a recent podcast episode from the podcast War on the Rocks, and their guest is Steve Blank. I haven't recommended a whole lot of defense industry podcasts because it's actually hard to find good ones. There's some that are terrible, the inside the Beltway kind. There are some that are interesting, but only 1 out of every 10 guests is actually valuable. And then there's War on the Rocks, which has a fantastic hit rate. And this episode features the guest Steve Blank, who is a Stanford professor. And he is at the Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation. I'll put a link to that episode in the show notes, but basically his point, for those of you that don't have time to listen to the whole episode, is that America's big, slow, bureaucratized military-industrial complex is a lot more like Russia's big, slow, corrupt state military system than is good for us, or, good for anybody. And while everybody on the internet is laughing about how Soviet Russia is driving tanks that they built in the 1970s, our Air Force is still flying airplanes we invented in the 1950s. And the corruption, corruption may not be the right word. It looks very different here. In Russia, the corruption is really obvious. Maintenance budgets going straight into the commander's pockets, etc. In the United States, it's not nearly that obvious, but I would like to point out just a few interesting observations. So, Microsoft just got a $22 billion contract to build a new IVAS augmented reality headset for the U.S. Army. They're actually, I think, really well suited to do that. They are probably the right person to go to. But they also spend about $10 million every year on federal lobbying, and they give millions and millions and millions of dollars in campaign contributions every election. And that helps. It's not bribery per se, but you got to remember that there is a tiny group of these giant defense contractors that are clamoring to get all of the business of that $800 billion annual defense budget. And it's hard to get into that very small circle. So Lloyd Austin is the current Secretary of Defense. He is the current Secretary of Defense partly because he was formerly a board member at Raytheon. He was a board member at Raytheon, partially because he was formerly a 4-star general. I'm just saying, if your company cannot afford to put generals on the board, or it can't afford to be on a first-name basis with the House Appropriation Committee members, you're going to have a hard time getting similar contracts. I'm not calling it bribery. I'm just saying it's hard to know who you need to know. And technically, these giant defense contractor companies are in the private sector. They should be benefiting from the competition of the free market, but they're not really competing in the free market with anyone except each other. And now they're so enmeshed in these big government programs that they have become, they move at the speed of government. And according to Steve Blank, the average major DoD acquisition program takes about 9 years to 26 years to fulfill, sometime inside of this range of roughly 10 to 25 years to deliver finished product. That is unbelievably slow. For reference, the global war on terror lasted for 20 years. It was an incredibly long war for America or modern times. And there are still DoD acquisition projects that started before that war that have yet to be delivered. There's this joke that commanders always plan to win the previous war. And the joke could be that they have to plan to win today's wars with the previous war's plan and the war before that's equipment. Now, I actually have a little bit of personal experience with this particular speed of military defense development. I worked on an undersea warfare project briefly called the Long-Term Mine Reconnaissance System. You can look it up if you're interested, LMRS. The project officially started in May of 1996, and then Boeing tested the first prototype in September of 2005. I was not on the project the whole time, but that is an incredibly long time, 9 years. And technology really needs to move faster than that in the free market or in war. I would say especially in war. In World War II, technology moved very quickly and development moved very quickly and production moved very quickly. So I looked this up the other night. The Army Air Forces flew over 100 unique airplane types during World War II, and the Navy flew another 100 unique airplane types, and there's less crossover that you might think between the Air Forces and the Navy. And most of these 200-ish airplanes were invented and built in between 1941 and 1945. So, to put that in perspective, the American War Office asked for, and the American companies delivered over 100 types of manned aircraft that they took from drawing board to combat in half the time that Boeing worked on this one LMRS project. And in that time, there were also massive innovation leaps. We went from making canvas-covered biplanes to fielding massive bombers and aluminum fighter jets. And part of that was the urgency of actual war. But a lot of that was the sheer innovative and industrial power of the U.S. free market at that time. It still was a very free market. There was still a very unencumbered economy, and that meant making very fast iterations, but it also meant really fast manufacturing. So in World War II, the shipyards were launching a new aircraft carrier every few weeks. Not a new kind of aircraft carrier, but a new actual ship every few weeks. And factories that had been making one kind of thing would retool to make something else. So in addition to making hundreds of thousands of Jeeps and trucks, Ford built 40,000 B-24 bombers. I'm not sure that Ford could actually build aircraft today. Boeing still builds aircraft, but not as fast as they were doing things at the time. During World War II, they built almost 100,000 aircraft. That was about a third of total aircraft production during the war. And they kept that up immediately after the war. In the 1950s, they were building supersonic jets, and they were building massive airliners, and they built the giant B-52 bombers that the Air Force is still flying today. Because government tentacles have really entangled U.S. manufacturing and slowed it down, kind of across the board, but inside of this defense sector even more. So Ford probably couldn't spool up that kind of production today, even if they were only building the Jeeps and the trucks, not even the bombers. And there was a different mentality, not just in the private sector, but in government as well. So in 1942, William Knudsen, who was the president of General Motors, he was appointed the director of production, and he was made a 3-star general. I've got some really significant differences with FDR, but bringing someone who knows private sector manufacturing into the military as a general to teach the military how to coordinate that enormous, the biggest material procurement job in history, was a really, really solid idea. And today, our government would probably do the opposite. They would pick some random 3-star general, probably someone who is a political appointee, but in a different way and for different reasons, and then send that person to Michigan to run GM and personally micromanage the welders and tell them how to make tanks. That's frustrating because defense is a really important job, and it's one of the very few jobs that the government should actually do. The fact that our government is so bad at national defense is really, really problematic. Now, we're used to the government being bad at stuff because the government spends a huge amount of time doing things that they have no legitimate responsibility to do. They have no jurisdiction there. They have no reason to do it. It is absolutely none of their business, and so it's not surprising when they do a bad job of it. And I think that at this point, a lot of us are just resigned to the fact that since the government has inserted itself into places where it has no business to be, like education or food or power, that we're just going to have to build alternative systems with their own money to build our own homeschooling or private school operations, to figure out our own food and agriculture operations, and possibly even more decentralized microgrid power operations, because there literally is no better option that is available. Defense is a little different, though, because it is the government's business. This is one of the 2 jobs that they actually have jurisdiction in. They actually have some business being involved in national defense. And so to see the United States government do national defense as badly as they do something like housing is pretty discouraging. And Steve Blank is pessimistic. He doesn't say he's pessimistic in general, but he is pessimistic that the larger U.S. military-industrial complex is going to change anytime soon. And I think that's pretty accurate, a pretty accurate statement from someone who is very close to the situation and sees the problem very, very clearly. But I'm fairly optimistic in general because I see something that Steve Blank may not see. I can see that there is a lot of civilian interest in martial virtues and a lot of civilian interest in military technology. So these little tiny military innovation companies, the people who are working on modern technology that is competitive, that is keeping up with what is possible, what is available, they might not be able to get a seat at the House Appropriations Committee table. They may not get to go to those fancy dinners. They may not get those giant contracts. But there is starting to be a market in the private sector of regular civilians for a lot of that kind of stuff. And that actually encourages me a lot. That probably will shed some light over why you, right now, today, as a civilian, can go out and buy rifles that are better than the ones that the military buys. You can buy drones that have better capabilities in a lot of areas than the military drones. They may not have the same durability. They may not have radios that the FCC has deemed illegal, but from a raw technological capability, a lot of the optics, a lot of the electronics, a lot of the drones, a lot of the things that you can buy right now as a civilian are miles ahead of the military. The military just has access to really, really durable stuff that is really, really expensive and only works because it doesn't have to follow FCC regulations or whatever. So in a sense, we're seeing both of these sides of the coin being really, really affected by government sluggishness. On the one hand, we have the private sector that doesn't have to deal with all of the DoD nonsense and run things through all of those committees. But on the other hand, they are significantly limited by a whole bunch of regulations from the FAA and the FCC, etc. And then on the other side, you have the military contractors who can kind of get around some of those things, but then they have to do everything at the speed of government. And so programs like the F-35 just take years and years and years. I know people who their entire job in this space is going to be defined by one project because that's all that they ever get to work on. Literally decades to develop something that is supposed to be cutting-edge technology. Am I happy that individual civilians and taxpayers that already paid a huge amount of their personal income so that the government could mess up education and food and power, and then also mess up defense so that we have to take the little bit that we have left and do all of that on our own dime personally by ourselves? No. But I do think that there's starting to be enough of these people that there is some capability of making up for that federal government shortfall. And that is something that we can see happening in Ukraine. Even with the huge amount of gun control that Ukraine had, even though the population was relatively disarmed and hadn't had an opportunity to do the kind of training and the kind of preparation that would have put them in a much better position to resist an invasion, they still managed to come together and, in a pinch, do tremendously good work in reorganizing themselves and really rising to the occasion. Having a civilian population that is better prepared and thinking through these things better puts you in a much better defensive posture as a nation, even a nation that has really messed things up at the official level at different times and in different ways. But again, I think that it also creates a unique opportunity for military companies or technology companies to see that perhaps they can't sell things directly to the Department of Defense. There is still a market for them to develop tools that have military application and sell those to a civilian population. They still have the ability to generate cash flow while they are competitive in these different areas. And that is something that is very encouraging to me. Now, is that market opportunity going to necessarily get the attention of the DoD so that some of this new stuff gets into the hands of our actual soldiers in enough time that they can fight the upcoming war and not the one after? Well, I'm not super optimistic about that. And it would require Congress to change that tempo. And, so I guess that tells you I'm not super optimistic about that. But it still is a fascinating opportunity for you and me and other civilians to learn more about this space and have access to more stuff. And it creates an opportunity for people who really want to be working at the cutting edge of this technology to ignore the DoD, to ignore the government buyers, to ignore those giant, tempting 20 years away contracts and focus on a way that they can provide stuff for people immediately. And not just for the purpose of defense, but also for the purpose of continuing to develop this technology and push stuff that will be competitive with other industries or other militaries that are a bit less unencumbered by that government sluggishness. So just another lesson from Ukraine, a fairly big one, and another opportunity to look to other industries for different tools that could be useful in the defense space. But I'm going to put a link to that War on the Rocks podcast down below. I think you'll find that interesting. And another time in history where the United States had some really fast, really agile technological development in this space was the Vietnam War. It didn't have the same effect on, say, American manufacturing, but that was when DARPA was really doing some interesting work. They were really at the forefront of what was going on in the war. They actually had offices right up by the front line, and they were figuring out what needs needed to be met and then trying to solve those problems quickly. And there's a book called The Imagineers of War that talks about that specific time and that kind of really fast development cycle stuff, building tools, life-saving tools for this space is really, really interesting. But even in that book, you can see as time goes on, government stuff gets slower. Academia gets lazier. All of this stuff happens even over the course of that book. So it's a pretty fascinating read that I would recommend to anyone that is interested in this. So thank you very much for listening to this podcast. Hopefully this is kind of an interesting idea that some of us may not have thought about a whole lot before, and I'm going to continue to research this because I find it fascinating.